Hey, welcome back to Edgar Cayce Narratives. If you've been following this channel for a while, you probably noticed that some patterns in life don't feel random, even when we try to explain them that way. And today we're going to look at one of those patterns that is easy to ignore at first, but becomes harder to dismiss over time. I want to talk about something very specific, and for some people, very personal, which is the feeling of always arriving just a little too late. Not in an obvious or careless way, but in a quiet and consistent way that starts to stand out the more you look at it. The job is already filled by the time you apply. The relationship ends right before you say what you needed to say, and the opportunity disappears just when you finally feel ready to step in. And none of these moments seem dramatic on their own, but together they begin to form a pattern you can't ignore. After a while, it stops feeling like bad timing and starts feeling like something deeper. And that leads to a simple but uncomfortable question. What if this isn't just life happening to you? And what if there is a reason you never seem to arrive at the right moment? At first, it doesn't feel like a pattern. It just feels like timing that didn't work out. And most people brush it off because missing one opportunity is normal and easy to explain. But for this person, it doesn't happen once or twice. It happens in ways that slowly start to feel connected, even if they cannot explain how. They remember applying for a job they genuinely wanted. They took the time to prepare. They thought it through. They waited until they felt ready. And when they finally submitted, they found out the position had just been filled. Not long ago, not months ago, but just before they arrived. And that detail stays with them more than the rejection itself, because it feels like they were almost there, but not quite on time. It shows up again in relationships, where they feel something building with someone. They sense a connection. They think about what to say. They wait for the right moment to express it clearly. And then suddenly, the other person moves on, or chooses someone else, or closes that emotional door. And again, the timing feels off by just enough to make it frustrating, but not enough to call it pure bad luck. In smaller situations, the same thing repeats in quieter ways. They arrive at events after something important has already been said. They join conversations just after a key decision has been made. They miss moments where they could have stepped in but didn't. And each time the gap is small, but the repetition makes it harder to ignore because it keeps happening across different areas of life. What makes it more confusing is that they are not careless. They are not someone who ignores responsibility. And they are not intentionally avoiding opportunities. In fact, they often think carefully before acting. They try to prepare. They want to do things properly. And from the outside, nothing about their behavior looks obviously wrong or reckless. There is also a sense that they are always close enough to see the opportunity, close enough to understand what could have happened, and close enough to feel the outcome clearly, but never quite close enough to be inside the moment when it actually matters. And that distance begins to feel more personal over time. At some point, they begin to notice that this pattern carries a specific feeling. It is not just disappointment. It is a quiet form of frustration that builds slowly, because each moment seems small on its own. But together, they create a sense that something is slightly out of alignment, something they cannot fully name but can clearly feel. They might try to explain it in practical ways at first, telling themselves they just need better timing, better planning, or faster action. But even when they adjust these things, the outcome does not fully change. And that is when the experience starts to shift from isolated events into something that feels more consistent. Over time, they stop focusing on each missed moment and start noticing the pattern itself. And this is where the experience becomes more personal, because it no longer feels like external circumstances. It begins to feel like something connected to how they move through life, even if they cannot yet explain what that connection is. And once that awareness starts to form, the question quietly changes from, "Why did I miss this?" to something more direct and harder to answer, which is, why does this keep happening to me in the same way? At this point, the experience begins to shift from individual moments into something that feels structured. Because when the same kind of timing keeps showing up across different areas of life, it becomes harder to treat each situation as separate, and the mind naturally starts looking for a connection, even if it cannot fully define it yet. They start replaying past situations, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet and analytical way, noticing how often the same sequence happens, where there is interest, then preparation, then hesitation, then action, and finally realization that the moment has already passed, and the consistency of that sequence becomes difficult to ignore. It does not matter whether the context is work, relationships, or personal decisions. The surface details change, but the structure stays the same. And that is what makes it feel less like coincidence, because coincidence usually looks random, while this feels organized in a way that repeats with subtle precision. They may begin to compare themselves with other people, noticing that others seem to move into moments more directly. They speak sooner, decide faster, or act without waiting for everything to feel completely certain. And while those actions are not always perfect, they often place those people inside the moment rather than just outside of it. In contrast, this person notices that their own process includes an extra step, something small but consistent, where they pause a little longer, think a little more, wait a little further, and that extra step, while it feels reasonable in the moment, often becomes the exact space where the opportunity closes. The pattern becomes clearer when they realize that the delay is not large enough to be obvious. They are not missing things by days or weeks in most cases. They are missing them by moments, by decisions that come just after something has already shifted. And that level of precision makes it harder to blame external timing alone. They might try to correct it by acting faster, by pushing themselves to respond sooner. But even then, the feeling does not fully disappear, because the issue is not only speed, it is something deeper in how they relate to the moment itself. And that is why simple adjustments do not fully solve it. Another detail begins to stand out, which is that they often feel ready just after the moment has passed. Not before, not during, but immediately after. And that creates a specific kind of awareness where they can clearly see what they would have done, what they would have said, and how they would have stepped in. But the timing no longer allows it. This creates a subtle but important shift in how they see themselves, because instead of thinking, "I missed one opportunity," they begin to think, "I tend to arrive just after things happen." And that difference changes the way they interpret future situations, making them more aware, but not necessarily more aligned with the moment. Over time, the idea of randomness becomes less convincing, because randomness does not usually repeat with this kind of consistency. And even though they may not have a clear explanation, they can no longer ignore that something about their timing follows a pattern that continues to show up. And once that realization settles in, the question becomes more focused and more difficult to avoid, because it is no longer about what is happening outside, but about what is happening within their own behavior and perception of timing. And that leads them to ask a deeper question. Not just why does this keep happening, but what is it about the way I move that creates this exact result again and again? As the pattern becomes clearer, the experience starts to feel less external and more personal, because it is no longer just about missed moments. It is about the growing sense that something in their own timing does not match the moments that matter, and that creates a tension that is difficult to explain to others. On the surface, everything still looks reasonable. They are trying, they are thinking carefully, they are making an effort to show up in the right way. And if someone were to observe their behavior, nothing would stand out as obviously wrong, which makes the situation even more frustrating, because there is no clear mistake to fix. Internally, however, the experience feels very different, because each time they miss a moment, there is a quiet realization that they were close enough to act, close enough to respond, but something held them in that final step, and that small hesitation begins to carry more weight over time. They may start questioning their own decisions, not in a dramatic or emotional way at first, but in a subtle and repetitive way, asking themselves whether they should have acted sooner, whether they waited too long, or whether they were trying to be too careful, and none of these questions bring a clear answer. This is where the contradiction becomes sharper, because on one hand, they believe they are doing the right thing by preparing, thinking, and choosing the right moment. But on the other hand, the result keeps showing that the right moment never seems to arrive while they are still waiting. That contradiction slowly turns into confusion, because their intention and their outcome do not match. And when that gap continues to repeat, it begins to affect how they see themselves, not just their actions, but their ability to engage with important moments in life. At some point, a specific thought starts to form more clearly, and it is not loud or dramatic, but it is persistent, which is the realization that it's not that I didn't show up, it's that I never arrive at the right moment. And once that thought becomes clear, it is difficult to ignore. This realization creates a deeper level of tension, because it challenges the idea that effort alone is enough. They are putting in effort, they are present, and yet the outcome still falls slightly out of reach, which makes the situation feel less like a simple problem and more like a pattern they cannot easily control. They might try to push against this pattern by forcing themselves to act earlier, by deciding faster, or by reducing hesitation. But even these efforts can feel unnatural, because they are reacting to the outcome rather than fully understanding what creates it in the first place. There is also a growing sense of doubt, not necessarily about their abilities, but about their timing, about whether they can trust themselves to recognize the right moment. And that doubt can create even more hesitation, reinforcing the very pattern they are trying to break. Over time, this tension becomes less about individual situations and more about their relationship with action itself, because every important moment now carries an extra layer of pressure, not just to act, but to act at the right time. And that added pressure can quietly increase the delay they are trying to avoid. What makes this especially difficult is that the pattern does not feel extreme. It is not a clear failure or a complete absence of action. It is a consistent misalignment that is small enough to explain away, but frequent enough to feel undeniable. And that combination keeps the tension unresolved. Eventually, they reach a point where the question is no longer about specific situations, but about something deeper. Because if they are always present, but never aligned with the moment, then the issue may not be about effort or opportunity at all, but about something in how they approach timing itself, even if they do not yet understand what that is. At this point, the pattern has become clear enough that it no longer feels accidental, but it still lacks an explanation. And this is where a different perspective begins to matter. Because instead of asking only what is happening now, we begin to ask where this pattern might come from, and why it repeats with such consistency. In the work of Edgar Cayce, there is a recurring idea that certain life patterns are not created entirely in the present moment, but are carried forward as tendencies, especially patterns related to behavior, hesitation, and how a person responds to important decisions. From this perspective, the issue is not simply that someone is unlucky with timing, and it is not that life is consistently closing doors at the wrong moment. Instead, the pattern may reflect a deeper habit that has been repeated before, where moments of action were delayed, avoided, or approached with hesitation over a long period of time. Cayce's readings often describe how repeated hesitation in earlier experiences, including past lives, can become a kind of carried behavior not as a fixed fate, but as a tendency that continues until it is clearly seen and consciously changed. And in this context, timing is not just about external events, but about when a person chooses to step forward. If someone repeatedly delayed action in earlier experiences, whether out of fear, uncertainty, or the desire to wait for a perfect moment, that pattern does not simply disappear. It can continue as a subtle form of misalignment, where the person still approaches moments with a slight delay that feels reasonable in the moment, but leads to missed timing. This reframes the experience in a very direct way, because instead of seeing the present as a series of unrelated missed opportunities, it becomes part of a longer pattern of hesitation, where the timing issue is not random, but connected to how the person has learned, over time, to approach action. It is important to understand that this is not described as punishment or something imposed from outside. There is no idea here of being forced to miss opportunities. Instead, it is described as continuation, where the same internal response to important moments keeps expressing itself in different situations. In this view, the moment itself is not the problem. The opportunity is still there. The situation still opens, but the response to that moment includes a delay. And that delay, even when it is small, becomes enough to shift the outcome. And when that happens repeatedly, it creates the experience of always arriving just after the moment has passed. What makes this perspective different is that it places the focus on behavior rather than circumstance. Because if timing is connected to when a person decides to act, then the pattern is not something happening to them. It is something happening through their own response, even if that response feels automatic. This also explains why simple changes, like trying to act faster, do not fully solve the issue, because the pattern is not only about speed, it is about the internal process that leads to hesitation in the first place. And unless that process is understood, the timing will continue to feel slightly out of sync. Another important part of this perspective is that awareness itself begins to change the pattern. Because once a person recognizes that their delay is consistent and not random, they are no longer reacting blindly. They begin to see the moment before it passes, and that awareness creates the possibility of a different response. From Cayce's point of view, patterns like this are meant to be recognized, not to create frustration, but to bring attention to a behavior that has been repeated long enough to become visible. And the purpose of that visibility is to allow change, not through force, but through conscious choice. This shifts the question in a very clear direction, because instead of asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" the question becomes, "What is it in me that keeps responding to moments in the same way?" And that shift moves the focus from external timing to internal alignment. And once that shift begins, the idea of arriving too late starts to look different, because it is no longer just about missing the moment. It is about understanding the hesitation that happens just before the moment, and realizing that this hesitation may not be new, but something that has been carried forward and is now ready to be seen clearly. Once the pattern is seen as something internal rather than purely external, it becomes easier to recognize how it shows up in everyday behavior. Because the late arrival is not just a final outcome, it is the result of a series of small decisions and delays that happen before the moment is lost. One of the most common ways this appears is through procrastination, but not in an obvious or careless way. It often looks reasonable on the surface, where the person tells themselves they will do something later when they have more clarity, more energy, or a better plan. And while each delay feels justified, the accumulated effect is that action keeps moving just far enough into the future that the opportunity shifts without them. Another form of this pattern shows up as waiting for the right moment, where the person believes that timing needs to feel certain before they act. They want the situation to be clear, the conditions to be stable, and their own confidence to be fully in place. And while this approach seems responsible, It creates a situation where the moment they are waiting for never actually arrives in the way they expect. There is also a quieter version of hesitation that happens internally, where the person begins to act but pauses just before committing. They think again. They review their decision. They imagine possible outcomes. And in doing so, they introduce a small delay that is not visible to others, but is enough to shift their timing out of alignment with the moment. Overthinking plays a significant role in this pattern, because instead of responding directly to a situation, the person creates multiple layers of evaluation. They consider what could go wrong, what could be improved, what might be misunderstood. And this mental process, while intended to create better outcomes, often slows down action to the point where the opportunity changes before they fully step in. Fear can also be present, but not always in an obvious way. It may not feel like strong fear, but more like a subtle resistance, a sense that something is not fully ready or not fully safe. And this feeling encourages delay without clearly identifying itself as avoidance, making it harder to recognize. Another important aspect is that the delay is often small, almost unnoticeable in the moment. It might be a few extra minutes of thinking, a decision postponed until later in the day, or a message not sent until it feels more complete. And each of these delays seems minor, but together they create a consistent pattern of arriving just after the moment has shifted. The person may also notice that they feel more clarity after the moment has passed, which creates a strange dynamic where they can see exactly what they would have done. They can describe it clearly, and they can even feel confident about it. But that clarity comes at a time when it can no longer change the outcome. This creates a feedback loop, because the more they experience this pattern, the more they begin to anticipate it. And that anticipation can add another layer of hesitation, where they become even more careful, even more thoughtful, and in trying to avoid missing the moment, they unintentionally reinforce the same delay. In social situations, this can appear as waiting too long to speak, holding back an idea until the conversation has already moved on, or choosing not to interrupt even when they have something relevant to add. And while these behaviors are often seen as polite or thoughtful, they can contribute to the same experience of being slightly out of sync with the moment. In work or creative contexts, it can show up as refining something too much before sharing it, waiting until it feels complete rather than allowing it to be seen in progress. And by the time it reaches that level of completion, the context around it may have already changed. What becomes clear through all of these examples is that the pattern is not a single action, but a consistent approach to timing, where action is slightly delayed in favor of certainty. And that delay, while it feels small and reasonable each time, accumulates into a pattern that shapes outcomes in a very specific way. And once this is fully seen, the idea of always arriving too late begins to shift again, because it is no longer just about missed moments. It is about recognizing the chain of small, repeated behaviors that lead to those moments being missed, and understanding that the pattern is built step by step long before the final moment arrives. When we look at this pattern through a psychological lens, the idea of arriving too late starts to feel less mysterious, because many of the behaviors involved have clear explanations in how the mind responds to pressure, uncertainty, and decision-making. And this helps ground the experience without dismissing how real it feels. One of the strongest factors behind delayed action is the fear of making the wrong move. Not necessarily a dramatic fear, but a steady concern that acting too soon could lead to rejection, failure, or regret. And this creates a tendency to wait for more certainty before committing, even when that certainty is not actually required. This connects closely to avoidance behavior, where the mind subtly delays action to reduce discomfort. And instead of saying, "I am avoiding this," the person experiences it as, "I just need a little more time." which feels reasonable and even responsible, but still results in postponing the moment of action. There is also a form of self-sabotage that works through timing rather than through obvious mistakes, where the person does not block themselves directly, but delays just enough to prevent full engagement with the opportunity. And because the delay is small and justifiable, it does not feel like sabotage in the moment. Overthinking plays a central role here as well, because the brain tries to predict outcomes before acting. It runs through different scenarios, weighs possible consequences, and attempts to optimize the decision. But this process takes time, and in situations where timing matters, that time becomes the difference between being inside the moment and just outside of it. Another important element is the need for control, where the person feels more comfortable acting when they understand the situation clearly, when they can anticipate what will happen, and when they feel prepared for different outcomes. And while this creates a sense of stability, it also reduces spontaneity, which is often required for timely action. The brain is also wired to protect against emotional risk, and this means that hesitation can be a protective response, not a weakness, because by delaying action, the person avoids immediate exposure to uncertainty, rejection, or failure. And while this protection works in the short term, it often leads to missed opportunities in the long term. There is a specific timing dynamic that becomes important here, which is that the mind often feels safest just before acting, when everything is still potential and nothing has been tested yet. And stepping into action means leaving that safe space. So the mind naturally stretches that pre-action phase as long as possible. This explains why clarity often appears after the moment has passed. Because once the pressure to act is gone, the mind no longer needs to protect itself in the same way. And suddenly, the person can see what they should have done, what they could have said, and how they would have responded. But that clarity comes without the urgency of real-time decision-making. Another layer is the habit of linking action to feeling ready, where the person believes they need to feel confident before acting. And since confidence often comes from action rather than before it, this creates a loop where they wait for a feeling that only appears after they have already missed the moment. From a psychological standpoint, none of this is unusual. These are common patterns in how people manage uncertainty and risk. But when these responses become consistent, they create a predictable outcome. And in this case, that outcome is a repeated experience of being slightly out of sync with important moments. What becomes clear is that timing is not just about external events aligning. It is also about how quickly and directly a person moves from intention to action. And when there are layers of hesitation, evaluation, and protection in between, the timing naturally shifts. This does not mean the person is incapable or unmotivated. It means their internal process is structured in a way that prioritizes safety, clarity, and control over immediacy. And while those qualities have value, they also come with the cost of delayed engagement. And when this psychological pattern is placed next to the earlier idea of a carried behavioral tendency, the picture becomes more complete. Because what feels like a deep, repeating life pattern can also be understood as a consistent way the mind responds to moments that require timely action. And that combination is what creates the experience of always arriving just a little too late. At this stage, the pattern is no longer just something observed. It becomes something understood in a more direct way. Because when you place together the repeated experiences, the behavioral tendencies, and the psychological responses, a clear realization begins to form that changes how the entire situation is seen. The key shift is simple but important, which is that timing is not only something that happens outside of you, it is also something that is created through your own actions, decisions, and responses. And once this is seen clearly, the idea of always arriving too late begins to take on a different meaning. Instead of viewing each missed moment as something that happened to you, it starts to become something you participated in. Not intentionally, not consciously, but consistently, through small delays, hesitation, and the need to feel ready before acting. This does not mean you are to blame for every missed opportunity, and it does not reduce the complexity of real-life situations. But it does introduce a level of responsibility that was not visible before, because it shows that your internal timing plays a role in how external timing unfolds. Another important part of this realization is understanding that the delay is not random. It follows a structure where intention appears first, then evaluation, then hesitation, and only after that does action take place. And when this sequence repeats, it naturally shifts your position relative to the moment. What makes this insight powerful is that it moves the focus away from trying to control external events and toward understanding your own response. Because external timing is unpredictable, but your internal process can be observed and adjusted once you are aware of it. It also clarifies why effort alone has not been enough, because effort applied at the wrong moment does not produce the same result as effort applied at the right moment. And if the timing of your action is consistently delayed, then even strong effort can feel ineffective. This realization can feel uncomfortable at first, because it removes the idea that everything is out of your control. But it also opens a new possibility, which is that if the pattern is created through your own behavior, then it can also be changed through a different response. The focus then shifts from trying to be perfect or fully prepared to recognizing when a moment is present and choosing to step into it without extending the delay, even if it feels incomplete or uncertain. And this is where a different kind of timing begins to develop. It is also important to see that acting earlier does not mean acting recklessly. It means reducing the gap between awareness and action, so that you are moving with the moment instead of slightly behind it. And this adjustment does not require drastic change. It starts with small shifts in how you respond. Over time, these small shifts can begin to realign your experience, because instead of consistently arriving after the moment, you begin to meet the moment as it is happening. And that changes not only the outcome, but also how you experience yourself in relation to opportunity. What was once seen as a pattern of bad timing starts to reveal itself as a pattern of delayed response. And once that distinction is clear, the entire situation becomes more workable, because you are no longer waiting for life to change. You are adjusting how you engage with it. And in that shift, the idea of timing becomes less about luck and more about alignment, where the moment and your response begin to meet at the same point, rather than slightly missing each other in a way that feels consistent but unexplained. At this point, the pattern is no longer something abstract or distant. It becomes something you can start to recognize in your own experience, not as a theory, but as a series of moments that may feel familiar when you look at them more closely. You might begin to think about times when you waited just a little longer before acting, when you told yourself you needed more clarity, more confidence, or a better moment, and how often that extra step felt reasonable at the time but led to the moment shifting without you. There may be situations where you can clearly remember what you wanted to say or do, but you chose to wait. And by the time you were ready, the context had already changed. And what stands out is not just the missed action, but the timing of your response. You might also notice how often clarity came after the moment had passed, when it was easier to see what you should have done because the pressure was gone, and how that pattern may have repeated in ways that felt small but consistent. This is where the question becomes more personal, because it is no longer about a general idea of timing. It is about your own relationship with action, hesitation, and the moments that matter in your life. So instead of asking why things keep happening too late, a more direct question begins to take shape. And it is a question that only you can answer through your own awareness. If you keep arriving just after something important has already happened, what moment are you hesitating to step into? And what would change if you moved before you felt completely ready? And when the next moment appears, not in a perfect or predictable form, but in the same uncertain way it always does, will you recognize it while it is still open? Or will you find yourself understanding it only after it has already passed? If this video made you stop and think about your own timing, then you're already starting to see something that most people overlook. And that awareness is where real change begins, because you can't adjust a pattern until you can clearly recognize it while it is happening. If you found this helpful, you can like and subscribe to Edgar Cayce Narratives to follow more stories like this, where we take patterns that feel confusing and break them down into something you can actually understand and apply in your own life without overcomplicating it. And if there is something in this video that still feels unclear, or if you recognize this pattern in a way that is slightly different from what was described, leave a comment and share your experience, because those details often reveal the deeper layers behind these patterns. You can also tell me what topic you want to explore next, especially if there is a pattern in your life that you don't fully understand yet, and I may build a future video around it.